live on YouTube. Just connecting Instagram as well. Okay, I'll just check. Hmm. Okay, we're live on both platforms, so we can start. Okay. Uh, Good evening to everyone who's tuning in. Today's live will be on the article A Regulatory Price Mechanisms for Crops Continues to be Desirable, which has been co authored by Sandeepan Bakshi, Tapas S. Modak, and Deepak Johnson. Allow me to introduce our speakers for the evening today. Uh, Dr. Deepak Johnson is a Japan's Society for Promotion of Science postdoctoral fellow at the Institute of Economic Research, Hitotsubashi University, Tokyo, Japan. Prior to this, he was an associate fellow at the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, Bengaluru, India. He holds a PhD in developmental studies. His interest areas are development economics and agricultural economics. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
We're also joined today by Dr. Tabas Singh Modak, who's an associate fellow of the foundation. He has a PhD in social science from the Tata Institute of Social Sciences, Mumbai. His research interests include the irrigation economy of India, water policies and institutions, agricultural policy, economics of farming, and rural incomes. He's also interested in the use of spatial technology to study the Indian countryside. A very warm welcome to you, sir.
Thank you.
Uh, so, to begin with, in your article for EPW, you begin by pointing out a grim reality. That is, and I quote, a vast majority of the Indian farming population continues to live in abject poverty. So, could we begin this discussion by understanding some of your findings from the village studies conducted by your organization, Foundation for Agrarian Studies, and what they reveal about the conditions of small farmers in India and the regional variations in the same? Dr. Tabasar.
Let me first thank you, Tia, and EPW team for inviting us for this lively discussion. Uh, since your questions is on the about from our findings from the village studies by the Foundation for Agrarian Studies, let me start with a brief introduction of the village studies program of the foundation. Many of you are aware that FS is an independent research organization based in Bangalore. And in the last 2 decades, a major activity of the foundation has been India-wide program of village studies. It is known as Project on Agrarian Relation in India. What we do, this is project to involve description and analysis, and we also create a detailed database of village level data of the diverse agricultural zones and socio-economic regions of the country.
Right.
Until now, we have surveyed 27 villages across 12 states of India. And drawing this unique and large-scale database, FS has been attempting it to take up various research questions of the rural economy. And drawing from this your questions, one of such efforts which is very related to your questions, that we also had in-depth studies what are the constraints of the small farmers in India.
Hmm.
And this work is published in an edited volume book. The title of the book is How Do Small Farmer Fares, and
Hmm.
it is edited by Madhura Shaminathan and Sandipan Bakshi. Let me, on your question, I'd like to highlight few important findings from our work and also from this book.
Sure.
First, I'll touch the definition because we are talking about the small farmers. Let me start with the what the definition of small farmers we say here. As you know that in majority of the academic work, small farmer are defined as those who are the operation holding less than the 2 hectare of cropland.
Right.
But it also is a fact from our village studies that there's a wide diversity in the countryside,
Hmm.
either in terms of the farming condition, irrigation condition,
Hmm.
or in different agricultural in regions of the India. Therefore, in this book, what we did, we have not gone with the traditional differentiation of the small farmer. What we did, we identified the small farmer with those with operation holding of less than 2 hectare of irrigated land,
mm,
or we take 6 hectare of unirrigated land, or any combination of these.
right,
Yeah. Now, from after defining this, the small farmers, we have gone the details on their different kind of condition. Let me first highlight the one of the findings here, that the from the 17 villages which is covered this book, we find that there's a crisis in both terms, either when we take as a small farmer household as a whole, or when we talked about the small farming,
right,
in terms of their inability to generate adequate incomes for the maintaining a standard of living. If I give an example, very in a kind of relative sense, when we take the ratio of mean income per household to the minimum wage as a reference, which kind of you can say as a line reference line, what we found that the ratio is below or close to the one in most of these study villages, which
mm,
means the income level of small farmer barely covered the expenses of the basic necessities.
yes,
Now, second point I would like to highlight, we are talking small farmer here, but also you have to keep in mind that these are not the homogeneous group in India.
mm,
There is a significant variation when you see in terms of the net returns from the crop income, as well
mm,
as overall household income across the agroclimatic condition.
right,
First, if you take an example, the income level is very low when you see the villages in the dry and unirrigated area. For
mm,
instance, a village in the northern Karnataka, or a village from the Rajasthan.
right,
And but when you compare with the irrigated region for a village like a Punjab or southern Karnataka, it is much higher when you see the net return from the crop income. But also, it's a fact that when you take it as aggregate, when you see as a small farmer, as a community, as a group of farmer, we also find that there's a significant difference between small and larger farmers. But also, if you keep in mind that when you talking about the larger farmer, these are a very small section of farmer in all our study villages, and these differences are accounting many factors. For example, for instance, what are the crop they're growing, what are the ownership and access to machinery and irrigation, how they access to the different inputs. They're all are factoring in the differences in the cost of their cultivation.
mm,
And that's why this book also come up with a striking finding that when we see that on average more than 20% of the small farmer household in most of these study villages made net loss from the farming, which
mm,
means that their cost of cultivation was more than their gross value of output from the crop production.
mm,
I will take my final point on this question from the small or about the small farmers, that when you look into their as a different source of income sources, or their income level from the different source, we find that agriculture as an occupation, when you see it as an occupation, quite a very low level of income, and
mm,
that's why they're not solely dependent on the agriculture. They had to diversify their income sources,
right,
and on average they engage in 4 to 5 separate sources of income. But at the same time, when you look into the income level from the non-agricultural employment and income, it is also limited and uncertain. Even in many cases it is lower than the average income for farming. Therefore, that this large section of the farming population in India, which is the small farmer, have to rely on both the source of income, farming, as well as the non-agricultural wise employment for their survival.
right. Noted. Thank you for laying out the context and exploring the stark variations for us. Dr. Deepak, despite a strong support for MSP within the broader farmers movement, MSP or minimum support price remains a much contested topic. In your piece, you outline three reasons why MSP continues to be relevant in the present context. Could you share those with us along with some examples?
Yeah, thank you, Tia and the EPW team for giving me this opportunity. And I'll start off from where Tapas left,
Yeah.
and he was talking about how difficult the conditions for small farmer
Mhm.
households are in
Yes.
much of rural India. Now, why is MSP relevant? And this also has a bearing on the particular fact that Tapas shared with all of us. But
Mm-hmm.
before that, like as the first point that we note in the article is that MSP's function in shaping cropping pattern in many places has been seen as something that is of strategic importance for long-term agriculture development in India. So it is well known that starting from mid 1960s and 1970s, the relevance of MSP has been quite significant in achieving food security,
Yes.
especially by concentrating production in northwestern states. Now, this is something that has a continued relevance. If you look at other kind of crops where we try to achieve some higher production, for example, millets has been discussed in recent times, and 2023 was the International Year of Millets, where many of the commentators had talked about how important is to improve the cultivation and area under cultivation of millets, especially because it's very healthy and also it's resilient to climatic shocks. So, in
Yes.
that sense, to improve millet economy or millet cultivation, assuring remunerative prices is something that's important, and having a robust MSP mechanism might be of help. And this has a sort of a relevance even today.
Right.
Now, the second point is in relation to what was the need for having MSP percolate into marginal and small farmers. Now, MSP, as the name suggests, is minimum support price. It is offered as a safeguard for at times when the price is below even cost of production, when there is an overproduction, sort of these kind of scenarios. But when it also has a price signaling mechanism. So a vast majority of farmers, being small and marginal, are also interlinked to different sorts of markets. So they have to depend on other big cultivators for credit support, and often these are the cultivators who end up buying their produce. So
Right.
given these kind of asymmetries in market, we cannot leave out all price discovery mechanism to market. We also need to have some reference range, or some sort of a signal as an MSP, so that the small and marginal farmers know what kind of support that they can get, if the and there is some reference for them to look up to. Now, thirdly, this also acts in a welfare meaning. As Tapas said, uh, non-farm is not something that has been successful in shifting a lot of farming population out of agriculture. It continues, but farmers often have to straddle, especially small and marginal farmers, have to always be involved in both the sides to make ends meet. So, in such a scenario, having some assured support in the sense of MSP, but it also means that it has to be significantly expanded than what it is right now. But
Right.
that is going to be a welfare support also to this group of cultivators and farmers who are otherwise having very low incomes. So these are
Right.
the 3 points that we stress in the article to
Yeah.
argue that MSP has a continued relevance even in the present.
Right. And do you think, the rise of extreme weather events or, climate change related factors are something that MSP can sort of insulate farmers a little bit from?
Yeah, in some sense, yes. Of course, that is not the best way. We need to have some crop insurance,
Sure.
and that's there in practice. I mean, I mean, it is there, but it is also not something that is accessible to a large sections of farmers. So,
Right.
in the absence of such a safety net as that of crop insurance, MSP is something that farmers can look up to, and
Right.
it will also act as a sort of solace when there is some extreme weather event. So that's true to some extent.
Absolutely. Dr. Tapas, you also attempt to tackle the question of what should, in fact, be the MSP, or as you put it, a desirable level for the MSP. What are some of the primary determinants while ascertaining the value of MSP, in line with the larger goal of, like both of you have mentioned, welfare of the farmers. What have been some of the contentions between the NCF's recommendation over the formula?
Yeah, I think this question has been, I think, we discussed excessively in our like policy discourse or like in our academic practice.
Yeah.
But when it started, like a how it started. I'll take you the one of the recommendation on the MSP. It was formed there's a one high level committee formed on long term grain policy of 2000, was chaired by Professor Avijit Sen. That time it told about that MSP should be based on cost C2, and they mentioned that cost C2 means all cost which include the imputed cost of family labor on capital and rental on land in most of the efficient regions. And that's how the term is the comprehensive cost of cultivation. So here, when I'm talking about the cost C2 here means the paid out cost means the cost for the all the material for the spend farmer spend for their cultivation plus imputed value of family labor on the interest of own capital and rental value of land.
Right.
Later on, when as you talking about the NCF, the National Commission of Farmer of 2006, chaired by Professor M.S. Swaminathan,
Mm-hmm.
what this commission did, they gave a detailed formula to how to arrive at through this as a new remunerative price, like what you can talk as MSP, through as a cost of C2 plus 50%.
Right.
And although this, of course, this recommendation was very, is like kind of a subjective in nature, but what they tried in this, they tried to be, it's like a benchmark of living standard of farmers against of a civil servant, which can actually, which is also require a big enough margin over the
Mm-hmm.
cost of production.
Right.
Now, we are there's a lot of debates on that what should be the appropriate level of MSP. It still continue in our discourse either it's, in the academia. But in the recent time, what is we also see that many of these reports or else a news comes when the MSP is announced, they often suggest or claims also the current level of MSP are already in accordance with the NCF formula. And you know that this have been a very long, have been a continuous demand from the different farmers, protests also. But
Yeah.
when we look into the data very carefully, unfortunately, this claim it's not true.
Hmm.
The central government, recently what they consider while announcing the MSP, they consider the cost A2 and FL. FL is means the opportunity cost for the family labor.
Right.
Let's give you an example how if you take a cost A2 plus FL and when you we take consider the cost C2 plus 50, how it's differ.
Right.
If we take an example, the last year the paddy production 2023-24,
Hmm.
the MSP was 24% lower than the cost C2 plus 15 percentage, which is about 60 84 rupees per quintal.
Right.
So this is the kind of a difference you see when it is announced based on the cost A2 plus FL, but when there's a recommendation or farmers, the most of the farmers agitation demands for the cost C2 plus 50%.
Right. So there's a big gap.
Yeah, a big gap.
So, Dr. Deepak, could you also explain the variations in farmers' cost of production across
Yes.
states
Yeah.
are factored into MSP estimations, and why you feel that there have been certain underestimations in costs of production in the past?
Right, right. Yeah. So this question has two parts. One is about how MSP is arrived at.
Yeah.
And as Tapas said, this is currently based on cost A2 plus FL, which includes all the paid out costs and imputed value of family labor. Now, this is different for different states. So the final MSP is derived as a weighted average of uh, costs from different states put together, and the weight being the share in total production. So as this is a weighted average, of course, this is not going to be covering some of the production costs in places where the costs are higher. Now, one example if we take is like the case of paddy. If you look at the costs or MSP as a proportion of, let's
Yeah.
say, cost C2 plus 50, what should have been the actual recommended one? Now, if in West Bengal, the cost of production is higher and MSP covers only 68% of that, what should have been the ideal MSP
Yeah.
or cost C2 plus 50? And in Punjab, it covers almost 100%.
Right.
So there are places like that in for many other crops, like for example, Odisha in the case of pulses, or Andhra Pradesh, and then Telangana, Madhya Pradesh to some extent when it comes to soybean, where the announced MSP is not covering the actual cost C2 plus 50 and
Yeah.
also cost A2 plus FL plus
Right.
50%, which is the basis for arriving at the national level. So the variations are not accounted for, but this is an ongoing debate and there is no perfect way to look at it. In some cases, economists say that, okay, you keep MSP as a weighted average so that it improves efficiency among farmers, so that an optimum level would incentivize farmers to be more efficient. So this goes on. But
Right.
then the second part is about the underestimation. So even in this calculation, some of the costs are actually projections based on past data. So CACP, the Commission on Agriculture Costs and Prices, the body
Yes.
that recommends MSP to government,
Yes.
actually uses 3-year-old data and then uses price indices to project what is the present cost.
Okay.
So some of the scholars, especially a paper in a review of agrarian studies, has looked into this gap between what is recommended and what was the actual cost, and they looked into fertilizer price and then saw that if the recommendations were actually based on the existing prices, then for some crops the MSP should have been like 20 to 30% in some years, which is
Right.
quite a big amount. And then
Yes.
there are variations between what states come up and then what MSP, the CCPC scheme, the scheme which collects data from individual states, they showcase. But the important point is what Tapas talked about as village studies, and there are some village studies that have shown that in fact there is this huge variation between different classes of farmers. So small farmers in many of the villages have been found to have higher cost in comparison to large farmers. So all these things have important implications on how MSP is arrived at, but
Yeah.
it is a debate, and perhaps there is no single way of addressing all these differences in a single MSP. But having a dialogue is probably a better way of looking into these aspects and then having a possible way out from what we have right now.
Absolutely. And also maybe a examination of the variations that you mentioned on a more nuanced level. Instead of debating whether or not we even need MSP in the first place, would be far more fruitful in the long run. Uh, what role do you think government procurement plays in effective MSP realization?
Right. So, p- if you look at the crops with higher share of procurement, and paddy for many years has had 30 to 40% of the total production being procured by government, we can see that at a national level, the wholesale price or the market price has moved very close to the MSP.
Right.
Now, such a relationship is not something that is visible for pulses and oilseeds for many years. So MSP in some cases in the beginning of 2000s were lower than the prices, and then in 2015 also, especially for pulses, there was a spike in prices. But then when we come to 2017, 18, 2020, then we see that MSP has been above 6,000 or close to 5,000 to 6,000, but the realized price is around 4,000 at an all India level if you take the average for both pulses and oilseeds. So that relationship is not there because there is very little procurement of pulses and oilseeds, and many years it has been very negligible. It has been around 5% or even less. So this sort of not having an effective procurement shows that MSP is not something that's, I mean, or it remains as a notional price, and it's not something that's realized by farmers on yeah, in reality. Yeah.
Right. Uh, Dr. Tapas, apart from, further, as you point out in your paper, why is there an increasing gap between MSP and the price
Yeah.
realized by most of the farming population for many crops in recent years?
Yeah. Actually, in our one of our recent work at FAS, we recently it's published a report. The title is the trends in cost and incomes from the crop production in India over a period of 20 years, from 2000 to 2020, led by Dr. Deepak. What we found that what we do that we analyze that all the CCPC data from the last 20 years, but in terms of the when you look into the figure of the MSP and the realized price, which is published by the same CSCP reports, we find, as you mentioned, that there's a widening the gap between these two figures, particularly in the last half decade. As Deepak was mentioning about the pulses, let me give a figure. Like for the paddy, it was for the last 3 years average between 2017 and 20 was around 1700 per quintal. And the but when you looked into the figure about for the average price realized by the farmer, it was around 1525, 1525 rupees per quintal. It means the gap was about like a rupees 200 rupees per quintal
Right.
in the last 5 years. But this gap was much below than the 100 rupees in the around 2010 or 2012. And this is not only for the paddy, as like Deepak also talking about the pulses. We also similar kind of trends we find for the other pulses and also the whale seed as well. When I trying to find what could be the explanation for this, one we see that while we see there's a sudden jump in the when the announcement of the MSP, the amount is mainly due to they have shifted their because it's maybe that time a lot of hesitation or the formal protest has been happening. They have come up with the shift in the calculation towards the method how they for the MSP towards such a like a cost of A2 plus FL in from the 2017-18. But at the same time, when the look in the data of the actual prices realized by the farmers, which did not show any corresponding increase in the recent time.
Right.
And as Deepak mentioned, that this could be a one of the that MSP can be efficiently work when there is a complementary of also other supportive from the state can provide. One of the like a more progressive procurement from the state. Yeah.
Right. Right. Uh, so, I'll pose my final question to both of you. Um, Apart from limitations in price determination, what are some of the other challenges that exist in farmers' actual knowledge of and access to MSP? And further, you conclude your piece by noting that MSP, however, is not a panacea for all evils that haunt Indian agriculture. In your opinion, which other important considerations apart from MSP need to be integrated into future frameworks for agricultural policy in India?
Okay, let me take the first question. Okay,
Sure.
see, I think important question, and the important point is if we come with there's a lack of access to the regulated market. It's remains a reality for the majority of farming population in this country. Let me again start with the recommendations from the NCF committee led by the chaired by the Professor Swaminathan. It's recommend that a regulated market in India should be available to the farmer within a radius of 5 kilometers, which means that the government should establish a network of regulated market so each market can serve an area of no more than 80 square kilometer.
Right.
But when you see the reality of the data, it is not even close to the benchmark which is recommended by the NCF in any of the state.
Right.
The all India average of the area served by this regulated markets is about 496 square kilometer, which is much more than what is the recommended. But
Right.
also it is not the average. But when you look into the wide the variation between across the state, it is
Hmm.
very wide. In Punjab, it is, for example, it's 160 square kilometer per market. In Haryana, it's 150 square kilometer per market. But it go to the very extreme when you looked into the very remote states like North Meghalaya, where it is about 11,215 square kilometer per market. This kind
Right.
of a wide variation exists for the uh, in terms of the access to the market, and it has implication on the ground, because it's also come up in the official statistics as well.
Yes.
Let me give a figure from the recent published situation assessments day survey of agricultural household. What it
Okay.
shows that a majority farmers even not aware of this MSP, and when you look, even those who are aware of the MSP, only a very significant share of the total produce they sold to these procurement agencies, which
Right.
means there is always it shows that there's a lack of the kind of access to the market which they can get away good can sell their produce at a regulated price,
Right.
or like a MSP.
Right.
Yeah. So
Okay.
about yeah, sure. Yeah. So about the other things that can be done apart from price, one factor that Tapas talked about were concerning infrastructure and institutional mechanisms like having stronger markets, then improving the awareness among farmers, and also there are other institutional factors that have to be looked into, like agrarian structure is something that studies by Foundation for Agrarian Studies have shown in the past. But then I would also like to stress upon some other things which are, relevant along with
Sure.
the price factors, like such as yield gaps, like improving the yield and yield growth, and by improving the yield, having a higher incomes for farmers is something that has to be explored further. And if you look at the case of paddy, like the average yield in India is about 40% less than the yield in China, and and many of the other world leaders. Within India, there are zones with very high yields and very low yield. Like for
Yes.
example, Punjab paddy yield is about 65 quintals per hectare, whereas in Odisha it's about 30 or so. So these yield gaps can be bridged to improve farmer incomes. Then there is irrigation, other technological improvements like better varieties, yield. High yielding varieties can be introduced. Then improving the irrigation itself is something that can stabilize yield and incomes to an extent.
Right.
Investments in agricultural research and extension is something that FAS has pointed out in one of the earlier reports, which was authored by Professor R. Ramkumar from Tata Institute of Social
Yes.
Sciences, where we examined for many years in 2000s that the budgetary allocation in real terms for agriculture research and extension have actually declined as a proportion of the gross value added from agriculture. So, in essence, the importance of these can be increased, which would lead to better scientific know-how among farmers, and thereby to have better farming conditions. So these factors also have to be looked into along with price and other mechanism that Tapas was also talking about earlier.
Yes. Right. Okay, thank you for unpacking the nuances of the conversations around MSP and for bringing us, very critical data from the ground, from your field studies. I think with that, I think we can call it a wrap to this particular conversation. Thanking our audience for patiently tuning in. At this point, we'd also like to share a side note to request you to subscribe to our channels and follow us on social media. Um, and a very, very warm thank you to both of our speakers for highlighting the nuances of the MSP debate and Hopefully, conversations such as these and studies such as these would lead to much a bolstered agricultural framework for India's growth trajectory. Thank you once again for sharing your valuable insights.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, EPW team, for this opportunity.
And I'd also like to take a moment to thank Dr. Sandeepan Bakshi for co-authoring this particular paper. For anyone interested in reading their article, it's available on our EPW website.